Thank you for the introduction, Gary. So, well, for starters, if I haven't said it to anybody, good evening, brethren and sisters. And when we go to verses 2 and 3 of our reading, there's a very important principle for us, and I want you to just have a look. I'm going to read it from the authorised version, which I'm using tonight, and see if you can spot, because the important principle is mentioned 3 times. Verse 2, I'm starting at verse 2. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago. Whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such an one caught up to the 3rd heaven. And I knew such a man, whether in the body or out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. So we find this important principle applied 3 times in 2 verses, and we can be assured that when in the inspired word there is something which is repeated here 3 times, that it is something that's important, and I wonder if you have spotted it. Now, I'm going to share a slide. It's a bit difficult to think of how best to do sharing this evening, because I've just got a small number of slides, so I'll probably leave up the previous slide for you. So subject, Paul and 3 mysteries, and here we have the clue. Hopefully now you can see it on the screen. You can see the important principle mentioned 3 times, that Paul is willing to say, I can't tell, I don't know. And you might ask, well, why is this so important? Well, human nature likes certainty. In fact, if we went back to the first letter to the Corinthians, and chapter 14, verse 8, there we read, verse 8, it's a short verse, for if the trumpet give an uncertain sound, who shall prepare himself for the battle? We all like and crave for certainty. Uncertainty is what makes people worried, it makes people nervous. We like to have certainty in our lives. And if we hear a speaker speaking on a subject, and he's perhaps saying a number of times, well, I'm a bit uncertain about this, I don't really know, it could be this, it could be that, then we'll tend to think that he hasn't prepared, that he hasn't done his research. But Paul shows in these verses that there's no shame in saying, I don't know. Of course, assuming that we have done our research. We need to be willing to accept there are things that we will not know before the return of Christ. And of course, as an audience, we can actually be guilty when there are prominent speakers at places like Bible schools of effectively putting that pressure on a speaker that we find speakers may say things that are speculative, and that can cause problems, because brethren and sisters will catch on to speculative ideas and think that they are absolutely robust, indisputable, proven ideas. Well, a few years ago, I wrote a brotherly email to a quite prominent speaking brother over a point where he had predicted a certain future event. And I was actually very pleased and surprised at his response. He replied that he was genuinely surprised that, as I mentioned in my email, that he was being repeated even in public talks as to the way that future events would unfold in the way that he'd said about this particular point. And he explained to me in the email that it was only his opinion, which he fully knew might be wrong, and he had assumed, possibly he'd mentioned it in one of his talks sometime in the past, he'd assumed that everybody understood that it was speculation, not absolute fact. So in matters such as prophecy of the future, which is full of uncertainties as to exactly how it will be fulfilled, there is that danger that we need to avoid. On the other hand, it's really important not to be uncertain about the first principles of the truth. However, the 3 mysteries that we're to look at tonight are going to involve some things which will remain uncertain. In fact, I hope in one case to create two new uncertainties for us to make us even more uncertain. Now, of course, what we're going to do as well is look at evidence, and perhaps we might even decide to eliminate some things that we might have thought as being possibilities in the past. And of course, we may form an opinion on the most probable solution, but it's always important to understand that probability is not the same as certainty. Now, the first mystery that I want to look at is one that isn't related to the reading, and that is the question as to whether or not the Apostle Paul had been a member of the Sanhedrin. Acts 26 verse 10, and I'm just going to look at the last few words of that verse. Acts 26:10 is advanced as evidence that Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, because to be a member you had to be married. Sorry, I've said that the wrong way around. It's taken as proof that 26 verse 10 that he was a member of the Sanhedrin, and then that is taken to imply that he was married. Because towards the end of the verse 10, we read, "And when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them." Now, if as some of you there I think you have a modern version, it probably says, "When they were put to death, I gave my vote against them." And the idea there being that Paul would have been voting in the Sanhedrin. Now, there's a problem here, because if we went back, and we won't do so, but if we went back to John chapter 18 and verse 31, sorry, we'll go there, we see that the Romans didn't allow the Jewish courts to condemn someone to death. So we may be heading into a problem. Verse 31 of John 18, "Then said Pilate unto them, Take ye him, Jesus, and judge him according to your law. And the Jews therefore said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put any man to death." Now, you might then go to the stoning of Stephen as evidence. He was speaking before the Sanhedrin, and then he was taken out and stoned. But that wasn't a matter of a vote of the Sanhedrin. If you read there in that chapter of Acts, you will see there that it was a mob riot that occurred. It wasn't something that was organised by a process of voting. Now, in the Sanhedrin, it is thought that they used stones for the purpose of voting. So a black stone would be dropped into an urn for guilty, and a white stone for innocent. Now, when we come to the Greek text in the verse that we read from Acts 26 verse 10, and we find the reference that in modern versions, "I gave my vote against them," the Greek text doesn't mention voting, it doesn't mention giving a voice against them, it doesn't mention anything like that. The Greek text talks of him throwing down his stone or pebble, and the translators have treated the Greek as idiomatic rather than literal. So that verse in Acts is saying, not "I gave my vote against them," but I threw down my stone against them. Now, the translators have treated that as idiomatic rather than literal. Now, before I go to a slide to explain about this, I just want to make sure we understand what we mean by idiom or idiomatic. If I say that someone has let the cat out of the bag, I'm sure that all of you will know that that means that they've given away a secret. There's no literal cat, there's no literal bag. And this is the way that the translators have treated that verse, as saying he talks about throwing down a stone. So they decide that they are going to see that as idiomatically, meaning that threw down a stone into an urn voting at the Sanhedrin, which actually is something of an assumption. Excuse me. I'm going to go to the next slide. Now, on this slide, you can see along the strip towards the top that it's there we have the Strong's numbers, and it says there, I gave my voice against them. And we have the Greek, the numbers for the Greek in Strong's as G2702 and G5586. So if you come across to the lower left side, you'll see there that the G2702 has the idea of bear down, bring down, cast down, or throw down, that sort of idea. And then it gives the idea of different further possible interpretations where it's applied. And in fact, it suggested the idea of giving somebody's vote. But the Greek itself, if we go to the top line there, to bear down, bring down, cast down, is the sort of very much the root idea. And then we're dealing perhaps with idiomatic applications a bit further down. Now, on the sort of middle right, we've got the G5586, and we see that is the idea of a pebble, and it's translated there as a stone in the verse that Paul throws down. And in fact, when we look at the structure of that Greek word, it's based on the verb to handle. So implicitly, it is a handleable stone. It's not a stone that's very, very small, not a stone that's too big to hold in your hand. It is the same stone that's used in Revelation 2:17 as the one that talks of having our names written on such a stone. So it's not a minute. It's a stone that you could hold in your hand to throw down into a vessel for a vote, but also it could mean a stone that you have in your hand for the purpose of throwing at somebody to kill them. So Paul, if we remove the idiom, is actually saying, and when they were put to death, I cast down my stone, implicitly at them, or whatever, or cast down my stone against them. Now, translators, of course, then have been faced with the dilemma, is it literal or idiomatic? And perhaps the reason why they've chosen the idiomatic meaning is that it would seem to be nonsense that Paul could be referring to his part in a stoning. Why would the person throw a stone down? Wouldn't he throw it at the person? So let's have a bit of an explore of this. And what I did, I actually had a look and did some research into stoning, and I found that stonings were not done in the same way that we might see a picture of Stephen being stoned in a Bible storybook. In fact, there's quite an extensive history of stoning in a range of cultures, particularly around the Middle East. And typically, a person who was to be stoned would be tied hands and feet, lying on the ground, or they would be thrown down from a height to inflict injuries so that they couldn't run away, or they would be thrown in a pit and stoned in a pit. And of course, we remember that there were pits in Bible times. Joseph was dropped or thrown into a pit, so was Jeremiah. And the law also addressed the responsibility if somebody's ox or ass fell in somebody else's pit. Now, in today's Iran, I understand that a pit is dug and a man is buried up to his waist before stoning. And of course, knowing this might help us understand the traumatised state of some of our Iranian brethren. So, in each of these cases, the person, whether they're tied or legs broken or in a pit, the throwing of the first stone could well be the person walking up to the incapacitated victim on the ground in front of the mob and throwing down the first stone at the victim, and then possibly retiring whilst everybody else throws their stones to kill the person. So it does potentially fit in with that idea. Now I want to go to the next slide. Now on this we've got various pictures. So on the top left there's a picture here from a Mormon source, and it's not a source that I would normally use, but in this case it might be right. You see, Stephen in Acts 7 verse 60 kneeled down and cried with a loud voice, saying, "Lord, lay not this sin to their charge." So Stephen wasn't tied up. Stephen hadn't had his legs broken, or otherwise it'd be very difficult to be kneeling down. And it certainly wasn't, as we've seen, another alternative, buried partly and then stoned. He, by implication, had his legs free and was able to make some movement. So the picture there of everybody round the edge of a pit throwing stones down at him to kill him could well be an accurate picture of what actually happened to Stephen. Hence the idea of throwing a stone down at him. On the bottom right we have a picture. It's actually from the BBC website, and this picture is from Afghanistan, and there is a woman with just her head visible at the top of the pit, and the mob standing round throwing stones down at the woman. I think as well they were in sort of virtually a semicircle with others a bit further out, possibly in case she managed to struggle out and run, but clearly taking care they're not hitting each other with their stones. And on the bottom left you can see exactly why the Bible storybook sort of picture of Stephen up against a wall and throwing stones wouldn't be practical. In fact, exactly this happened a few years ago in the UK with a yob who threw a stone through the window of a bank. A few days later they replaced the window with toughened glass. A few days later than that the yob came back and threw half a brick at the bank window, which bounced, hit him on the head and caused a severe head injury, upon which his mother tried to sue the bank. On the top right you can see why it's unlikely that they would stand in a circle around the person unless they were actually buried in the ground, because if you missed you'd hit the person on the opposite side. And remember, we're talking here of stones being thrown with enough energy and weight, mass in the stone to cause people injuries, bringing about their death. So the question of whether or not Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, and hence the question of whether or not he was married, remains open. But perhaps there is reasonable doubt to the idea in Acts 26:10 of using that as proof that Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin and therefore was also married. Well, in our next puzzle we're going to go to our reading. So we're going to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 1 to 5. And I'm wondering whether to go to the next slide at this point. Just a minute. Let's leave that slide up, and I'll explain that in a few moments. So reading from the first 5 verses, or at least part of those first 5 verses, of 2 Corinthians 12, it is not expedient for me doubtless to glory. I'll come to visions and revelations of the Lord. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, God knoweth. Such an one caught up to the 3rd heaven. And there it mentions, and I understand that word caught up, it can also mean the idea of caught away. In the Greek, and you've got that idea again, verse 4 if I read it, it could be read caught away into paradise or a beautiful garden, and then here's unspeakable words not lawful for a man to utter. Well, it's generally understood, so I'm not going to go into that Paul himself is referring to himself sort of modestly here, but the question is, what is the 3rd heaven? So I remember first coming across a particular explanation about 45 years ago as a relatively young man on a campaign, and a reasonably well-known Welsh-speaking brother in the discussion suggested what it meant by the third heaven, and it all seemed to make sense. I've since then heard some horribly complicated solutions, but I prefer the solution I'm about to describe because of its simplicity. Now, it's generally accepted that there will be no literal destruction, physical destruction of the heavens and the earth when we go in a moment to 2 Peter chapter 3. And of course we can see evidences of the fact that the heavens and earth will not be literally destroyed when Jesus returns in Zechariah 14:16 and in Isaiah 65:22. Now, I'll just quote from Zechariah 14, although I'm sure nobody will doubt what I'm saying. So verse 16, "And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feasts of tabernacles." That's Zechariah 14:16. So we see there that when Christ returned and the great amount of destruction has occurred, that there are still nations with survivors, so there can be no literal destruction of heaven and earth. So let's open our Bibles at 2 Peter chapter 3, and we'll have a look at verses 5 to 7. Verse 5. "For this they willingly are ignorant of, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of the water and in the water, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. But the heavens and earth which are now, by the same word, are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." So looking at it, in verse 5, we have the heavens that were of old and the earth. So logically, we would say this is the first heavens and earth. So we would have our first heaven here. Then, of course, in verse 6, we have the flood. And then in verse 7, we have, "But the heavens and earth, which are now, by the same word, are kept in store." And in verse 6, that word world is the cosmos that was then destroyed. And we have the heavens and earth which are now, as opposed to verse 5, which is the heavens that are of old that we have. So we have the second heavens in verse 2, sorry, in verse 7, and then if we have another look at the end of verse 7, we see that this second heavens and earth, the ones which now are kept reserved unto fire against the day of judgment. So in verse 6 we had the flood, and in verse 7 we have a judgment with fire. If we then look at verses 12 and 13, we see some expansion on the idea that's in verse 7. Verse 12, "Looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of the Lord, wherein the heavens, being on fire, shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Nevertheless, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness." So we see in these ideas the destruction of the flood, and in this coming destruction at the return of Christ, to establish the new heavens and new earth at that time, which would be our third heavens and earth. In each case, we're seeing the destruction of the works of man, and to some extent a destruction of man with survivors. In the case of Noah, it was just 8 people. Noah, his 3 sons and the wives. But we also see as we've seen from Zechariah, that in that destruction there will be those in the nations who will also survive. So we've seen verse 5, heavens and earth of old, the first. Then verse 7, the heavens and earth that now is. And in verse 13, the new heavens and earth. So we have the three lots of heaven and earth. Now, back in verse 10, just to reinforce it's talking about the return of Jesus, we see language there that we would associate with the return of Jesus as a thief in the night. Verse 10 of 2 Peter chapter 3. But the day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night, in the which the heavens shall pass away with a great noise, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. The earth also and the works that are therein shall be burned up. So we have man's works, particularly there, being burnt up for the establishment of this new heavens and earth. So, of course, 2 points to make about verse 10. We have a destruction which is going to be unexpected, especially for those who are not awake and alert. So it's important for us as watchmen to be awake and alert, doing those things which are pleasing, so that our Lord will be pleased with us when he returns. And secondly, it's quite clear here that the coming as a thief is in no way indicating some invisible, unnoticed coming. We can see the great destruction that comes with it, that this is not something that just passes unnoticed. And so we have a summary on the slide there that you've probably been following, with the first, the second and the third heavens and earth. And of course, whether Paul was physically projected into that future time or whether it was a vision, I must say I know not. But before we move on to our third mystery, just checking the time, I'll move rather quickly through those. Before moving on to our third mystery, also just making the point that typically we find in symbolism the heavens referring to the ruling powers, and the earth those who are ruled. So we potentially in these cases have a literal meaning and a spiritual meaning. And so in the case of Paul, I would suggest here having going to the heavens of essentially this third period, the third heaven, that we're looking here to him being with the resurrected saints in the millennial age. And that would be my suggestion for you in terms of what the third heaven is implying here, mainly based on 2 Peter chapter 3. So realising actually I've raced through that rather fast, we might take a little bit more time on our third mystery, which to me actually proved one of the most interesting of the mysteries. Now, the third mystery is about what was Paul's thorn in the flesh. What was the thorn in Paul's flesh that we find referred to? And that, of course, being there in our 2 Corinthians chapter 12. In fact, I'll just get my Bible over. I've got my quotations printed in the notes. So I'm just going to go to 2 Corinthians 12 just to make sure we're all together on this. So it's verse 7. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice that it might depart from me. So that's what we're looking at the moment as a mystery. What was this thorn in his flesh? Now, it's often said that we can let Scripture interpret Scripture, and there is wisdom in that concept. However, there is a danger that we can first decide what the answer is, and then selectively use the Scriptures to prove it. And if you have a look, as I did because of having debates with an ex-colleague at work who's a Catholic. I went on to some Catholic websites to look at some of their arguments so that I could have the discussion with my ex-colleague. And I found on subjects like the devil, the Trinity, what else? Transubstantiation, the purgatory, that they go to fragments of verses out of complete context, and they quote the Bible to support those false doctrines. Because the way they're doing it is to take a fragment of a verse outside of its context, and those particular words appear when presented in a certain way to support their doctrines. So it's very dangerous for us to start with an idea, and it's important when looking at a subject, if we're going to look at the scriptures, for example using Strong's or whatever to try and find every reference that might be related, to look at all of them with an open mind, and actually when we find ones that don't support what we're saying, to have a think about it and sort of question, have we got some intricate detail wrong? Do we need to rethink some of those details? So some have suggested, in terms of the understanding of the thorn in the flesh, that it was a problem with Paul's eyesight. And we could go to a quotation from one of his letters where he talks about what large letters is written to you when you look at the Greek. That might imply that he had bad eyesight, and the fact that he had other people write letters for him. Now others say that the thorn in his flesh was the opposition of Judaizers and others promoting false doctrines. So the Judaizers, for example, trying to take ecclesias back to be circumcised and to follow the law of Moses. Others promoting ideas like that the resurrection was past already. Well, I'm going to suggest some alternatives, and the alternatives actually are closely associated with that second idea of oppositions to Paul, but not exactly that. Well, let's have a think about the idea of the thorn in the flesh being opposition to Paul's work within ecclesias where there were those who were promoting false ideas. If you want to go back to it, it's Numbers 33 verse 55 that I'm going to quote, and this is a verse which is used to support the idea that the thorn in the flesh was false teachers who were making Paul's life difficult. Verse 55, Numbers 33. But if ye will not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then it shall come to pass that those which ye let remain of them shall be pricks in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and shall vex you in the land wherein ye dwell. So we need to look at that verse, not with a fixed idea that we're using this verse to prove that it was oppositions to Paul that were the thorn in his side, but we need to look at the verse and say, let's see what it's actually telling us. So we see the idea of thorns in sides being those who are opposing, so that would appear to support that idea. But there are also indications that we need to consider. If Paul means to refer back to this verse, why does he say a thorn in the flesh rather than thorns in his side? You see, he uses the singular a thorn rather than plural thorns, and he uses side rather than flesh. Now, we can't claim similarities as being conclusive proof whilst ignoring differences, so that tends to make us have to question whether this is not going to give us absolute proof. This is something that gives us a bit of evidence that might be in favour, and also some contra indications that may indicate that it isn't the case. Now, I might think to myself about people who claim similarities as conclusive proof whilst ignoring all the differences. And there's a really good example of this when we look at evolutionists claiming the proof of the evolution of the horse. And in, I understand now, in the vaults of a New York museum, there are the bones which were used to prove the horse evolved. The bones were found in different parts of the world, and when dated later on, they were found to be, the dates were all over the place. But the argument of evolutionists was that as they lined them up, from one to the next, there was a similarity which proved that the one had descended from the other. And then there were differences which proved that evolutionary processes had taken place. So basically what they said, any similarity between the bones proves evolution, and any differences prove evolution. And you might notice there's a fundamental logical flaw in that argument. So we have to beware of ignoring differences when we're looking at similarities to prove our argument. So let's have a look at further at 2 Corinthians and chapter 12. In verse 8, Paul says, that it might depart from me. Again, he uses the singular, it might depart, and from me. He doesn't say that it might depart from the ecclesias, or that they might depart from the ecclesias. So we're again seeing something that doesn't quite fit. Verse 9, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather glory in my infirmities. See, Paul is speaking of his weakness, his infirmities. He's not talking about other people. And coming back to that idea of the thorn in the flesh, when we look at the idea of the thorn, this is taken in the Acts where it refers to it as being cattle goads. But when we look in the Greek at that word, the idea of the thorn, it essentially is derived from a verb, and it just means something pricking into something. So we're talking not of necessarily some external poking with a stick, but something which can be internalized. Like a thorn, when you've got a splinter in your finger, it's something that's in you. Verse 10, therefore I take pleasures not in people persecuting me, but he says, he does reverse that slightly, but he says I take pleasures first of all in infirmities. Then we have in reproaches, in necessities. He does have there in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. So he's actually saying it's with all joy that he accepts that these difficulties and trials are coming upon him. He says then, for Christ's sake, for when I am weak, then I am strong. So here we see a range of things that he's suffered, and in a way he's glad that he's been able to suffer willingly for Christ. But we see the focus is very much on the suffering that he's had, rather than the people who have done it. Now, the next slide that I'm going to look at here rather surprised me, because I actually felt fairly in favour of the idea of the thorn in the flesh until I prepared this talk as actually being the people who are opposing Paul. Now, let's see if that works. There we are. So what I did was something which is used in industry. It's called, at least where I worked, an is-not diagram. And we have there some statements from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And then I've put on headings there, eyesight and oppositions. So we see there, we have the thorn in the flesh. something that is afflicting Paul, and it's in the singular. Eyesight, that might be reasonably supportive of eyesight. We can tick that, that would fit. It's something we can think about, just how painful an eye is if you get an eye problem. Oppositions, I'll put question marks. I'll put question marks to say, I'm not going to cross it out completely, but I don't feel comfortable with that being in the singular. Okay, messenger of Satan. Eyesight, what's the idea? Messenger of Satan. And oppositions possibly might fit a bit better, but a messenger, singular, what's this about? Buffeting, I understand the Greek word there has the idea of hitting with a fist, and particularly as if you're in a crowd and somebody's coming up behind you and surprising you and hitting you with the fist. That really doesn't fit. There's no sudden buffeting, there's no sudden being hit, impacted, if he's got poor eyesight. But perhaps it might fit if he's suffering people who are coming along and or getting letters, people who are causing damage in the ecclesias. So that might fit in there. We then come to that it might depart from me, not that they might depart from the ecclesias. It might depart from me. An eyesight problem, that would seem to possibly fit, but the oppositions doesn't really comfortably fit. Paul is glorying in his infirmities. Yeah, that would fit the eyesight. Definitely not fitting external opposing forces. Therefore I take pleasure in my infirmities. Fits the eyesight, not the oppositions. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Yeah, well, eyesight again, but oppositions, Paul's weakness, perhaps when being opposed. But what we're seeing overall is, on this, it sort of tends to favour the eyesight idea, and the oppositions one is not doing very well at all. But what we'd really like is some other idea that puts ticks in all of the boxes. And we'll have to come to that in a few moments. So we might then ask, where else do we find Paul suffering from being pricked in his flesh? Give you a moment to think about that. Where else do we find Paul suffering being pricked in his flesh? And of course, the answer is at his conversion. And it was said there that Saul was kicking against the pricks. Now, if we took these pricks, or again the idea from the verb, it's the idea that the thorn, the pricks, the pricking in his it doesn't say where it is here. Is it in his side? Is it in like a thorn that's actually in his flesh, feeling something, just like when you've got the splinter in your finger and it hurts? Jesus does talk about kicking against that pricking, and of course it could likewise be an animal with a thorn sticking in its leg, kicking against the pain, trying to kick whatever it is when the thorn's stuck in there, just as it could be like the bull kicking against a cattle goad that's being used to drive it. So we might ask, what was the pricking in Saul of Tarsus's flesh at that time? Was it external opposition? Were the people who were poking at Saul of Tarsus with sticks to stop him doing the persecution? Well, no. I would suggest that what was going on here was an internal conflict that was created by the evidence of Stephen's speech to a man who was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. That here there was a conflict between heart and mind. You see, Stephen's argument, and Paul, I'm sure, with the sort of man that he was, who had studied at the feet of Gamaliel, would be used to argument from the scriptures. And Stephen's argument was totally robust. And I'm sure that was a totally convincing argument if you were open to accepting it. But there would be one obstruction in the mind of Saul of Tarsus and in the mind of other people, which is, in the case of Saul of Tarsus, being a Pharisee of the Pharisees, to accept the logical proof that I suggest his mind was telling him was just so much in opposition to what his heart was telling him, that if he accepted this, his best friends, his fellow Pharisees, would be his deadly enemies out to kill him. It would also mean that he had participated in the murder of at least one innocent man and persecuted and imprisoned and beaten others. And it would mean that he would have to go along and submit himself and apologise to those who he was currently going out to pursue, to imprison and to kill. And psychologists call this state where the mind and the heart conflict, they call it cognitive dissonance. This conflict between heart and mind, and it tends to lead to all sorts of responses and quite often an emotional response, such as anger. And that anger is engaged with instead of weighing up the evidence in logical argument. So, as we see even in the Acts there, the idea of that thorn in the pricking that he's kicking against isn't necessarily the idea of somebody externally prodding him, even Christ prodding him. It can be something that's embedded in him, that's causing him that pain and anguish. So let's consider some of these alternative ideas that we're going to look at. In verse 10, Paul spoke of persecutions and distresses. Well, we're going to go back to chapter 11 now of 2 Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians 11, where Paul lists some of those distresses and troubles that he went through. So 2 Corinthians 11 verse 24, of the Jews 5 times received I 40 stripes, save one. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. Paul suffered traumatic events. And we have 3 examples. That those physical beating and whipping, very similar concepts. Then being stoned and being shipwrecked. So in those 2 verses we have those 3 separate items. And we can imagine the shipwreck hanging onto a piece of driftwood, and he talks later on to that being for a night and a day, 24 hours up to his neck in water, really thirsty but can't drink that water. And it's not unreasonable to think that Paul could have suffered from what we'd call post-traumatic syndrome or post-traumatic stress disorder, resulting in those having flashbacks, reliving those incidents that had occurred to him, and those things happening at the most inopportune moments. Such flashbacks can even mean the memory of things like the taste and the smell coming back. But what about the messenger of Satan buffeting them in then? If we think about that was mentioned in chapter 12 verse 7, again a singular, not talking about many opponents. Let's go to Luke 22 verse 3 to see this idea of Satan. And we find in Luke 22 verse 3, here we have Judas about to betray Jesus. Verse 3, then entered Satan into Judas, surnamed Iscariot, being of the number of the 12. Well, we know that this isn't some physical being entering into Judas. It's the thought coming into his mind. And so could we have a similar case with Saul here, this messenger of Satan being things that are internalised, that shock him, possibly post-traumatic disorder causing flashbacks. And in fact, that was not my preferred alternative, but one brother, when I presented this recently, said that he really could associate with that idea, because he himself, from some past traumas, actually suffered flashbacks that would sort of come in from, a bit like this buffeting, there's flashbacks that would seem to hit him from most inopportune moments. So it's possible that the stonings and things like that standing in front of a crowd, some angry gesture, might bring back the stoning, or somebody just patting him on the back, being pushed down to be beaten, or in the night waking up with the taste of the salt water in his mouth, feeling that he was drowning. Well, Romans chapter 7 verse 23 could lead us to what is my preferred alternative, which may be totally wrong. Romans 7 verse 23, where Paul says, "But I see another law in my members, warning against the law of my mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members." So Paul is talking again about another internalised problem, the problem of the flesh, that warning against the nature of the flesh. And could it be that Paul, who we once remember as being Saul, the angry man, could find there were times when that anger would come back, that he would be overwhelmed with rage against those who he should be loving, that he should be loving his enemies. And we think of him, we can think of the nature of Saul of Tarsus, Acts 9 verse 1, breathing out threatening and slaughter. 9 verse 5, kicking against the pricks, getting angry again. Acts 15:39, the sharp contention between Paul and Barnabas, and we see other examples where Paul perhaps gets rather angry. So I'll go to the next slide. So here we have those alternatives, and we can see the two there. So potentially, when we look at all of these flashbacks due to some internalised problem, outbursts of rage due to the flesh nature and the personality that Saul of Tarsus had, the angry man, that might emerge. So we can see all of those, and I've realised the time's gone by, so my apologies that I perhaps should have finished slightly earlier, and I will conclude at that point. Thank you.